Daniel Carter had exactly $43 in his checking account and a 7-year-old daughter who believed with her whole heart that Saturday pancakes could fix almost anything. He did not know, on the morning the new neighbor knocked on his door with a dog leash wrapped twice around her trembling hand, that his entire life was about to be rearranged by an animal he had never asked for, and a woman he would spend 6 months trying to understand. If you have ever opened your door to a stranger and felt the ground shift just slightly beneath your feet, stay with this one until the end. And if stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe, because what happened next will stay with you long after the credits roll. The house at 214 Maple Hollow Lane had been quiet for 3 years, ever since Daniel's wife, Rachel, died in a car accident on a rain-slicked overpass outside town. He had rebuilt his life the way a man rebuilds a house after a storm, one board at a time, without complaining, because complaining wouldn't put the roof back on. He worked as a carpenter, the kind who still measured twice and cut once out of respect for the wood, and he came home every evening to a small blue 2-story house with a white porch, where his daughter Lily waited with crayon drawings and 100 questions about his day. Lily was small for 7, with light brown pigtails and a spray of freckles across her nose, and she had inherited her mother's habit of narrating her own life out loud, as if the world might forget what happened if she didn't say it first. Daniel noticed the moving truck 2 weeks before he ever spoke to the woman who arrived in it. She moved into the yellow house at the end of the cul-de-sac, alone, carrying boxes herself in the rain, refusing help from anyone who offered, including Daniel, who had walked over with a thermos of coffee and an offer to carry the heavier furniture. She had thanked him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and closed the door before he could say much else. Her name, he would later learn, was Emily Hayes. She was younger than him, maybe late 20s, with wavy auburn hair that fell past her shoulders, and a face full of light freckles that made her look, at a glance, almost as young as Lily. But there was something in the way she moved, quick, watchful, always checking the street before she stepped outside, that made Daniel think of a woman who had recently escaped something, though he couldn't have said what. It was a Friday evening in early October when Emily appeared at his door, the golden light of sunset behind her, a leash wrapped tight around one hand, and a medium-sized golden retriever mix sitting obediently at her feet. The dog had cream gold fur, a permanently crooked left ear, and the patient, hopeful eyes of an animal that had learned to read human faces for information about what happens next. Emily's voice shook slightly as she introduced the dog as Biscuit and asked, almost too quickly, if Daniel could watch him for the weekend. A family emergency, she said. Just 2 days. She promised she would be back Sunday night, and she pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand with her cell number and a list of Biscuit feeding times, as if she had prepared for this moment long before she ever knocked. Daniel should have said no. He had a daughter, a mortgage, a job that started at 6 in the morning, and absolutely no room in his life for someone else's dog. But Lily had already appeared behind him in the doorway, already kneeling on the porch with her hand extended for Biscuit to sniff, already laughing when the dog's tail thumped against the railing like a drumbeat. And there was something in Emily's eyes, not quite fear, but close to it, that made Daniel say yes before his brain had fully caught up with his mouth. Emily thanked him 3 times in the space of 10 seconds, kissed the top of Biscuit's head, and walked quickly back toward the yellow house without looking back, the way people walk when they are afraid that looking back will make them change their mind. Rachel had been the one who wanted a dog, back before the accident, back when their biggest worry was whether Lily was ready for kindergarten, and whether the roof over the garage would hold through another winter. Daniel had always said no, gently, citing the mortgage, and the long hours, and the fact that a carpenter's schedule left no room for training a puppy. After Rachel died, the conversation had died with her, filed away in the same drawer as 100 other plans they'd never get to finish. So when Biscuit trotted up Daniel's porch steps that October evening, and sat down as if he already knew the house. Some small, buried part of Daniel recognized the moment for what it was. Not a coincidence exactly, but the kind of quiet symmetry grief sometimes hands you when you least expect it. Sunday night came and went, and Emily did not return. Daniel told himself Monday that family emergencies sometimes run long. He told himself Tuesday that maybe she'd tried calling and he'd simply missed it. So he tried her number himself 3 times and got only a flat, mechanical voice telling him the number was no longer in service. By Wednesday, he had walked to the yellow house twice, knocked on both doors, peered through a gap in the curtains at boxes still half unpacked in the front room, and found no sign that anyone was coming back anytime soon. He called the local shelter to ask what he was supposed to do with a dog that wasn't his, and the woman on the phone told him gently that unless he wanted to surrender the animal to the system, where a dog with an unclear history might wait months for a home, his only real option was to keep waiting and keep the dog safe in the meantime. Lily, listening from the hallway with her arms wrapped around Biscuit's neck, made the decision for both of them before Daniel had finished the sentence. "We're not giving him away," she said, in the same tone her mother used to use when a decision had already been made, and further discussion was simply a courtesy. So Daniel kept Biscuit. He bought a bag of dog food he could not really afford and a second-hand crate from a neighbor 2 streets over, and he added, "Walk the dog," to a daily schedule that already had no spare minutes in it. What he did not expect was how quickly the routine would stop feeling like a burden. Biscuit had a habit of resting his head on Daniel's knee during the news at night, a small, warm weight that Daniel found himself missing on the rare evenings the dog fell asleep early. Lily, who had been quiet and careful since her mother died, a child who smiled for other people's benefit more than her own, began laughing in a way Daniel hadn't heard in 3 years, chasing Biscuit around the backyard until both of them collapsed in the grass, breathless and grinning. There is a particular kind of grief that lives in a house after loss, a silence that settles into the corners, no matter how many lights you turn on. And for the first time since the accident, Daniel noticed that silence had gone somewhere else for a while. Halloween arrived 9 days into what Daniel had started privately calling the arrangement, and Biscuit wore a small orange bandana Lily insisted on tying around his neck before they walked the block together. Lily dressed as a firefly, and Daniel trailing behind with a flashlight and a bag for candy. He mostly ended up carrying himself. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to Daniel since Rachel's funeral stopped to admire the dog and ask, carefully, how the little family was doing. And for the first time in 3 years, Daniel found himself answering, "We're doing okay," and meaning it, rather than saying it as a formality to end the conversation faster. Biscuit, it turned out, was an easy excuse for the neighborhood to check in on him without the awkwardness that usually came with checking in on a grieving widower. And Daniel was grateful for the disguise, even as he understood exactly what it was. 2 weeks became a month. Daniel asked around the neighborhood, cautiously, trying not to sound like a man reporting a crime, and learned almost nothing. The realtor who had sold Emily the yellow house said she'd paid in cash and given surprisingly few personal details. Unusual for a young single buyer in a small town where everyone typically knew everyone's business within a week. The mail carrier confirmed that mail was still arriving, mostly forwarded bills and the occasional plain envelope with no return address. None of it collected. A retired police officer who lived 2 doors down, a stout, silver-haired man named Walt, who spent his afternoons on his porch pretending not to watch the street, told Daniel that in his experience, people who vanish that cleanly and that fast are usually running from something, not toward it, and that Daniel should be careful about attaching himself too deeply to a stranger's dog and a stranger's mystery. Lily's 8th birthday fell in the middle of that long, uncertain stretch, in early March, and it was the first birthday since her mother's death that she asked for something specific. instead of simply going along with whatever Daniel planned. She wanted a dog-shaped cake, and she wanted to invite 3 girls from her class over to meet Biscuit. And she wanted, most surprising of all, to leave an empty chair at the small kitchen table, in case Miss Emily comes back today. A request that broke Daniel's heart a little even as he said yes without hesitation. He baked the cake himself, badly, and iced over the cracks, and spent the party watching his daughter laugh with actual friends for the first time in years. The empty chair sitting at the end of the table, like a quiet promise nobody had made out loud, but everyone in the house had somehow agreed to keep. But Daniel had already attached himself. He noticed it the day a woman from the next town over recognized Biscuit at the veterinary clinic and asked, with unmistakable relief in her voice, if Daniel had adopted him from the description on a lost pet website. Daniel's chest went tight before he even understood why. He asked her, carefully, if she knew where the dog had come from before that, and she told him only that a neighbor of hers had mentioned a young woman with a golden retriever mix who used to volunteer at a domestic violence shelter 2 counties away, walking dogs for the families staying there, before she suddenly stopped showing up months ago. It was the first real thread Daniel had to pull on, and pulling it kept him up at night, more than the mortgage or the missing rent from Emily's still empty house ever had. He drove out to the shelter himself one Saturday in November, leaving Lily with a neighbor for the afternoon, telling himself he only wanted to return a spare leash he'd found in Biscuit, his crate with the shelter's name stitched into the fabric. The woman at the front desk recognized the leash immediately and grew quiet when Daniel asked, as casually as he could manage, whether she remembered the volunteer who used to bring this particular dog around. She told him, in the careful, practiced way people speak when they've been trained not to say too much, that she couldn't discuss any client's information, past or present, but she thanked him warmly for returning the leash and said, just before he left, that whoever he was looking for was lucky to have someone worried about her. Daniel drove home with more questions than he'd arrived with, and the distinct, unshakable feeling that Emily Hayes was not simply a woman who had grown bored of a new house and a new town. Thanksgiving came and went quietly, just the 2 of them, and the dog at a table set for 4, out of old habit Daniel couldn't quite break. Lily's teacher called that week, not with a complaint, but with a genuine question. She wanted to know what had changed at home, because Lily had started raising her hand in class again, had started inviting classmates to sit with her at lunch, had drawn a family portrait for an art assignment that included, without any embarrassment, a golden dog standing between her and her father, where her mother used to be drawn standing alone. Daniel sat in the school parking lot after that call for almost 10 minutes before he could make himself drive home, turning the conversation over in his mind, understanding for the first time just how much weight his daughter had been quietly carrying, and how much of it Biscuit had somehow helped her set down. It was around this time that Walt, the retired officer 2 doors down, began stopping by, more deliberately, ostensibly to see the dog, but really, Daniel suspected, to keep an unofficial eye on the situation the way old cops keep an eye on things long after they've stopped carrying a badge. Walt had spent 26 years on a Metro police force before retiring to Maple Hollow Lane for the quiet, and he recognized the signs of someone running from danger the way other men recognized a bad transmission by sound alone. He didn't push Daniel for details he didn't have, but he made it clear, in his own gruff and roundabout way, that if the woman from the yellow house ever did show back up, and if she needed anything more official than a place to sleep, Daniel should call him first. By December, Biscuit slept at the foot of Lily's bed every night, and Daniel had stopped flinching every time he passed the yellow house at the end of the street. He had, without quite meaning to, begun building an entire private theory of Emily Hayes, a woman running from someone dangerous, hiding in a small town under a name that might not even be her own, who had trusted a stranger with the one living thing she couldn't take with her into hiding. He didn't know if the theory was true. He only knew that every time he looked at Biscuit resting his graying muzzle against Lily's shoulder, he hoped, fiercely, that wherever Emily was, she was safe, and that whatever she had run from, she had won. Christmas that year was tighter than most. A slow month of carpentry work, combined with a vet bill for Biscuit's ear infection, left Daniel counting coins from the jar on top of the refrigerator to make sure Lily's gifts were wrapped and under the tree before she woke up. He almost called the shelter that week, just to ask, hypothetically, what it would cost to surrender a dog he had never officially adopted. But he hung up before anyone answered, unable to imagine Lily's face on a Christmas morning without Biscuit curled under the tree beside her. Instead, he picked up 2 extra jobs in January, building shelving for a hardware store across town, and told himself, the way he'd told himself so many hard things since Rachel died, that they would manage, because they always somehow did. January brought a letter, unsigned, mailed from a city 3 states away, containing only a single folded $20 bill and a note in careful handwriting. For his food. Thank you for trusting me. I'll explain everything when I can. Daniel read it 4 times before he showed it to anyone. And when he finally told Walt about it over coffee, the older man's face softened in a way Daniel hadn't seen before. That's someone still fighting to get free, Walt said quietly. You don't run that kind of race by yourself. Sometimes the only thing you can carry with you is knowing your dog is loved. Daniel folded the letter into his wallet, where it stayed for the rest of the winter, a small proof that he hadn't imagined the fear in Emily's eyes that October evening. Winter passed the way winters do, in a house with a child and a dog in it, messily, loudly, and faster than Daniel expected. Lily taught Biscuit to shake hands, then to fetch her stuffed rabbit specifically, then, with the endless patience of a child who has decided something matters, to sit calmly beside her while she read aloud from her favorite books, a habit the school counselor later told Daniel had visibly helped Lily's confidence in class. Daniel, for his part, found himself talking to the dog the way he used to talk to Rachel, thinking out loud about work, about bills, about whether he was doing right by his daughter, and Biscuit would simply tilt his cutters, mend, and turns hold, offering the kind of undemanding company that asked nothing in return. It occurred to Daniel, somewhere in February, that he had built a small, unexpected family out of a weekend favor that never ended, and that he was no longer entirely sure he wanted it to. Then, on a Tuesday in April, exactly 6 months and 4 days after she'd left, Emily Hayes came back. She looked different, thinner, her auburn hair cut shorter, a healing scar just visible above her collarbone that she didn't try to hide, and there was a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there the night she'd first knocked on Daniel's door. She stood on his porch in the same fading October light, and before she said anything else, she dropped to her knees when Biscuit came bounding out the door, burying her face in his fur, while the dog whined and pressed his whole body against her, as if he'd been waiting exactly for this. Daniel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, more relieved than angry, though he had rehearsed anger for months, in case this moment ever came. Emily told him the truth in pieces, sitting at his kitchen table, while Lily reluctantly took Biscuit outside to give the adults privacy. She had left an abusive relationship 8 months before moving to Maple Hollow Lane, she said, changing her name, cutting off contact with everyone she'd known, moving 3 times in a year to stay ahead of a man who had promised, in the specific and quiet way that terrified her most, that he would find her. The weekend she'd asked Daniel to watch Biscuit was the weekend she learned her ex-partner had traced her to the county, and she had run again within hours, taking almost nothing, because she knew if she brought the dog with her onto buses and into shelters and shared rooms with strangers, either the dog would be turned away or the dog would slow her down enough to be caught. She had chosen, in the space of one terrified afternoon, to trust a stranger with kind eyes and a little girl on his porch, because it was the only choice that let Biscuit stay safe while she disappeared completely. Her voice caught only once, when she described the 2 nights she'd spent sleeping in a bus station 3 states away, wondering if she'd made a mistake trusting a man she'd known for less than a season, wondering if she would ever see the dog again, let alone the little girl who had knelt on the porch to greet him. She told Daniel about the shelter that finally took her in for good in November, the counselor who helped her file the paperwork for a protective order, and the long, grinding months of court dates and depositions that followed, each one pushing her return date further out than she'd promised herself the last one would. She apologized for the silence, for the fear that had kept her from calling, even once she reached a safe city, explaining that she'd been warned not to contact anyone from her old address until the order was finalized, in case a phone record or a postmark gave away where the dog, and by extension she herself, might resurface. The 6 months that followed had been a blur of safe houses, a court order finally granted in February, and a slow, exhausting climb back into a life where she could use her real address again. I kept thinking about what kind of person just hands a stranger a dog and disappears, Emily said, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, without drinking from it. I used to think it made me a coward. Then I'd remember you sent me that photo of him wearing a little bandana on Halloween, and I realized it was the bravest thing I'd dog. Rose, trusting somebody I barely knew, because I didn't have anyone else left to trust. Daniel hadn't remembered sending that photo until she mentioned it. He'd texted it to the number on her folded note back in October on instinct, never expecting it to reach her, never imagining she'd carried it with her through shelters and courtrooms, as proof that some part of her old life was still safe. Daniel listened without interrupting, the way he imagined a good friend would, and when she finished, he told her the only thing that felt true, that Biscuit had never once been a burden, that Lily had needed him more than either of them had known, and that whatever Emily had been running from, she was welcome to stay in Maple Hollow Lane for as long as she wanted, because the street, and the house at 214, already thought of her as one of their own. What surprised Daniel most in the weeks that followed wasn't Emily's gratitude, though there was plenty of it. It was how naturally she folded into the rhythm of his and Lily's life, as if the 6 months hadn't been an absence so much as a slow, careful introduction. She came by most evenings, at first to see Biscuit, and then, gradually, simply because Lily asked her to stay for dinner, or because Daniel had started saving her a chair, without quite admitting to himself why. Walt, watching from his porch with the satisfaction of a man whose instincts had finally been proven right about something good instead of something dangerous, told Daniel one evening that some stories don't end where you expect them to. They just quietly become a different kind of beginning. By the time the maple trees along the street turned gold again that October, a year to the week since Emily had first knocked on his door, Daniel had stopped thinking of Biscuit as someone else's dog. He was simply theirs, his and Lily's, and, more often now, Emily's too, since her house at the end of the cul-de-sac had somehow become the place where the 4 of them gathered on Sunday afternoons, the dog moving contentedly between all 3 of them, as if he had always known this was where he belonged. Lily, older now by a year, and considerably braver, liked to tell anyone who would listen that her family had started with a dog nobody meant to keep, and that sometimes the people who are hardest to trust turn out to be the ones worth waiting for the longest. Walt marked the anniversary in his own way, showing up on Daniel's porch with a 6-pack and a story he'd apparently been saving all year. The story of how, 20 years earlier, a young officer named Walt had once driven a frightened woman and her 2 children 400 miles to a shelter, on his own time, off the books, because the system moved too slowly, and some people couldn't wait for paperwork to catch up to danger. I've seen good people run before, he told Daniel, watching Biscuit chase a tennis ball across the lawn in the fading light. Not many of them get a happy ending like this one. Most of them just get to be safe, which has to be enough. You gave her both. Daniel didn't have a response for that beyond a nod. But he understood, more clearly than he had in a long time, that the last year hadn't just changed Emily's or Biscuit's. It had quietly repaired something in his own that he hadn't realized was still broken. Lily's class did a show and tell that spring, where each student brought something that represented their family, and she brought a photograph of the four of them from Walt's anniversary barbecue: herself, her father, Emily, and Biscuit, sitting in the grass together, none of them looking at the camera, all of them laughing at something just out of frame. When her teacher asked what made this particular family special, Lily reportedly said, without hesitation, that her family was the kind that started as an accident and turned into the best thing that had ever happened to any of them, and that sometimes you had to trust a stranger with something you loved to find out you weren't strangers at all. Daniel never got a dramatic apology from the universe for the 3 years of grief that came before that October evening, and he never expected one. But he did get a golden retriever with a crooked ear who taught his daughter how to laugh again, and a neighbor who trusted him with the one thing she couldn't carry into hiding. And in the quiet, ordinary months that followed, the walks, the dinners, the small, unremarkable Tuesdays, he found something that felt, unmistakably, like his life beginning again. Some nights, after Lily and Biscuit had both fallen asleep, and the house had gone quiet in the particular way houses do once the day's noise finally settles, Daniel would sit on the porch steps and think about how close he had come to saying no on that October evening, to protecting his small, careful, rebuilt life by simply closing the door on a stranger's request. He thought about how easy it would have been, how reasonable, how nobody in the world would have blamed him for it. And every time, he arrived at the same quiet conclusion, that the life he had been protecting so carefully wasn't half as full as the one that found him the moment he stopped protecting it and just said yes. Some doors, it turns out, are worth opening even when you have every reason to say no, and some 6-month weekends turn into the rest of your life.